Hello, my name is Carlette Norwood Ritter. I am a sociologist and PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham. Today, for World Social Work Day 2020 and the theme of climate change. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how climate change links to environmental racism. My work at the University of Birmingham is I have conducted a comparative study of the racial experiences between Black American women and Black British women. So, racism is my area of expertise, particularly microaggressions and how the effects of societal racism affects disenfranchised minorities and minority ethnic groups. So I wanted to link the concerns of disenfranchised communities on climate change and how it affects us through environmental racism. My undergraduate degree, I did my senior seminar thesis on the effects of Hurricane Katrina in the United States and how the Black people of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans were disproportionately treated by all levels of government. So this is an area that is very much interesting to me and why I wanted to present on it today for World Social Work Day. So we will get started. Um, Climate change links to environmental racism in many different ways because people who are wealthy have enough access to resources to be able to anticipate and adapt to climate change. But people who are poor and live in poorer countries don't have the same access to those resources. Resultant of colonialism and the residual effects of slavery, genocide, trickle down economics, and white supremacy all play a role in what the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu called climate apartheid. In terms of demographics, BIPOC people are disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change. Their homes are being flooded, their lands are being flooded, the local economies are disrupted, drinking water has become unpure, and they are subject to extreme heat waves. These are particularly in the Central American region in the United States, and the governments are not taking action to protect their poorer populations. Climate change interacts and worsens already existing inequalities in society that are often already shaped by racism. So climate change just serves as to exacerbate the already existing conditions. Climate change requires an intersectional approach that also takes into account the most impacted communities, not just the rich and wealthy. And so scientists, environmentalists, and racial justice advocates all agree that the best way to overcome the climate crisis is by empowering and listening to indigenous communities. So environmental racism occurs when race, more so than income and class, determines where the polluting industries dump their toxic waste. They don't deposit their toxic waste in what we would call first world countries. They seek out third world countries in order to do this. This is an example of how colonialism fuels capitalist commodification. So, the history of the colonial era and slavery demonstrates how the global economic system and its dehumanization of certain populations have brought the world to the brink of an ecological ruin. The modern era's transactional relationship to nature has led to forests, wetlands, and marine habitats to become destroyed solely for their commercial purposes. And it also explains why the fossil fuel industry has been able to lie and misinform the public for so long. Because of these wealthy companies, they're able to manipulate and dominate their industries. So let's take a look at some specific examples of how climate change links to environmental racism. So in the United States, Black and Indigenous communities have been protesting climate change and the effects of climate change for a very long time. They've been protesting pollution from the coal factories animal processing facilities where waste from these plants are dumped into their water, and garbage incinerators that cause public pollution and cause significant health problems. So in 2016, in Dakota, North Dakota, the native communities protested against a pipeline that was being built in their community. Water protectors were involved in taking action against the construction and the disrepair of these multiple pipelines, um, and other projects that were fueled by the fossil fuel industries and other companies that led to the contamination of their water. Problem is, the protests were peaceful and very ceremonious among the indigenous people, but as the norm with peaceful protests, they were met with over the top law enforcement resistance. They were strong armed, they were shot with water cannons, rubber bullets. People were seriously injured when they offered no violent protests whatsoever. So people are trying to take a stand against the abuse that they're receiving on their land. These are indigenous lands, native lands to the people, the native people of America. They are there to protect their lands, protect their water, and they are met with strong arm resistance by law enforcement. Again, supremacy overpowering the disenfranchised and marginalized communities. As temperatures and sea levels rise, BIPOC people are disproportionately impacted in the US, but all around the world because of how historic injustices have left them exposed to environmental crises. So it's not like this is just happening. This is just resultant of historical racism and its impact. So racism, as I have explained in other seminars that I've taught, is uh, it's racial discrimination, but it's also economic power. That is what racism is. Racism doesn't really exist without economic power. So this is a pure example. Environmental racism is a pure example of how climate change affects disproportionate and marginalized communities more impactfully because they don't have the economic power, they don't have the governmental power, they don't have the political power to evoke change to protect their own communities. So, particularly in Michigan, in Flint, historical, structural, and systemic racism combined with implicit bias played a huge role in causing the Flint water crisis. And if you don't know what that is, they haven't had clean drinking water in Flint, Michigan for years. And if you look at these pictures, the this tube here is an example of one of the water pipes that delivers the drinking water to the community of Flint, Michigan. Up here, you can see the different colors. Water we know is supposed to be clear. These are examples of bottle of in these bottles of the different colors and the way the water looks in Flint. And as you can see here, a fireman who opens up a fire hydrant, how contaminated the water is. And this has been going on for years. This didn't just happen. And no president, no senator, no governor is really taking a handle of this. People have been having to ship in bottled water, import bottled water from other states uh, just so they can have drinking water, so they can bathe, and these type of things. And it seems like no one is adhering to their pleas for help. So the people of Flint have been subjected to unprecedented harm and hardship because of their structural and systemic discrimination and racism. It's corroded their city, their institutions, and their pipes for generations. This has been going on for years. If we look in Central and South America, the migrating from Honduras and Guatemala is really complicated because these people are having to flee their countries because they are experiencing extreme drought or flooding, and they can't utilize their soil like they have been able to in the past. They can't use it, so they have to move to urban environments or flee their homelands completely. And if migrants try to claim asylum based on climate change, they won't be given access. So they're not even able to relocate in other places because they can't use climate change as a reason for fleeing their country, even though they can no longer sustain their livelihoods there. So when we hear in racist rhetoric, people say, "Go back to your country," in most cases they can't, and if they do, they will starve to death. Wealthy countries can spur climate action, for starters, by waiving the debt of poor countries. Most poor countries stay uh, in poverty because they can't afford the debt that they owe to wealthy countries. And so, this again, uh, uh, it is systemic racism, institutional racism, which prohibits stratification, growth, um, the dream that we've been told exists. These people aren't able to do that because they are so indebted to the wealthy countries. And this is how, again, racism is economic power, and unless you have wealth, you don't have power. So, COVID-19 recovery plans also offer governments an opportunity to invest in global climate change, poverty eradication, and improved public health, but they don't apply the funds to that, or we wouldn't have these disproportionate situations. These efforts can advance racial justice by prioritizing adaptation measures for BIPOC communities. The decade ahead can feature a green economy, recovering biodiversity, and thriving communities, but only if the investments are made. Again, wealthy countries have a tendency to spend their money on the wealthy. And so we know that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this is why these types of COVID-19 and climate change affect these BIPOC communities more prevalently than any other community. There needs to be increased BAME representation worldwide in the race for climate change. So let's take a look at that for a second. Most people have heard of Greta Thunberg. I don't like to generally make statements like that when I talk about everyone or most people, but when in regard to climate change, Greta Thunberg has become the face of environmental change and climate change. But before Greta, about 27 years ago, 12-year-old Severn Suzuki spoke at the Rio Earth Summit, which was a UN plenary session in 1992, but she largely was ignored. She didn't gain momentum. There are so many similarities in the speech that she gave at that summit to what Greta Thunberg is saying, but she was totally ignored. And if people had listened to her back then, um, I can only imagine where we might be in regard to climate change right now. But many speculate that she wasn't listened to, perhaps because she wasn't the right face for climate change. People weren't prepared to listen to a person that looked like her. So, Vanessa Nakate is an Ugandan climate justice activist. And for several months, she was the lone protester outside of parliament in Uganda. But eventually, she started to gain momentum with her message. And now her face is also associated with climate change. However, as a Black woman, she was received very differently than Greta. So, for an example, there was a picture taken of youth environmental activists. And as you can see on the top picture, there she is right there. Vanessa is right here, and these other climate activists who happen to be white. So when the photo was published in the newspaper, Vanessa's picture was cropped out, and just these people were featured in the article in the picture. She was completely cropped out. And when confronted about it, uh, The photographer said he was trying to edit out the building in the background because it was a distraction. That was his excuse. But as we can see in the bottom picture, there are plenty of buildings back there. So that didn't seem to be a problem. Plus, with Photoshop, he could have easily Photoshopped the picture out, but he intentionally cut Vanessa out. And it caused outrage on social media. For example, this person over here posted, "Climate activists of color are here, but the media portrayal of the movement often misrepresents this. The climate crisis affects community of color the most, and that side of our struggle can't be overlooked." So there was severe backlash for that, but that's really unacceptable. There's no excuse for that. There are other ethnic minorities who are speaking out about climate change. As young as 12 years old, this is a Flint, Michigan resident. Mentioned Flint in a few slides back. But she's 12 years old, but she is very, very strong in the fight against climate change. Flint Lives Matter. They are really working very hard to try to get sustainable drinking water. You would think in a U.S. city that this wouldn't even be happening, but because Flint is a majority black city, it is pretty much forgotten and ignored. And in Mexico City, we have Miss Bastida. I'm not sure how to say her first name, but she is not also a woman of color, 17, who's working very hard outside Mexico City to in environmental activism. And Professor Matei in 2004 was the first African woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her dedication to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. And finally, Dr. Zalo, she created the Greening Youth Foundation because she wanted to educate future generations about the importance of preservation. And she has developed school programs that provide access to nature for disadvantaged children and young people in U.S. and West Africa. So there are plenty of Black activists for climate change who don't get the recognition because perhaps they don't have what's considered the right face to speak out globally. So, on a final note, I just want you to know that historically, water protectors and it's just very interesting that the spokesperson for climate change is a young woman because water protectors and earth activists have typically been women, and some speculate that the reason for that is because water provides life and so do women. So after all, we are the daughters of our Mother Earth. So it's not unusual to see women really taking up the charge uh, in the race for climate change. So that ends my presentation, and if you have any questions, Dawn has my contact information, my email address. Feel free to drop me a line. So thank you, and I hope to see you all soon.